we're going to talk about in genetics is pedigrees. So pedigrees are just basically a family tree that shows the inheritance of specific traits and relationships within a family. So there are a few things you need to know about reading a pedigree. So first of all, this pedigree here shows that some of these people are deceased. Okay? We don't really track that at this stage of the game. However, these are not the easiest sheets to make on Microsoft Word on my own, so I typically just get pictures from other sources. So that's why this one looks like this, okay? So what you need to know is that squares are male, okay? So this is a male here. Circles are females. That's a female. If they're shaded, that means they're affected with whatever trait we're looking at. So we're going to do some practice problems with, like, I don't know, hairy knuckles or freckles or attached earlobes. And no one really cares. No one says, I'm not going to have children because they might have a hairy knuckle. I don't like that. Ew. Nobody says that, right? But if we're looking at fatal genetic disorders, then you may want to know if there's a genetic disorder in your family that's fatal or incurable. You might want to know what the chances of you passing that on to an offspring are. So that's where pedigrees come in, okay? So again, if they're shaded, you have to look at what the question asks, because that question may be asking, maybe telling you that this is attached earlobes, or it may be telling you that it's cystic fibrosis, okay? So if we have this horizontal line here, that indicates a mating or a marriage. It used to always be a marriage, but people are having offspring together that aren't always married, and that's okay. So that's what that horizontal line indicates. If we look at this, this indicates the offspring of this mating or marriage. Okay, so this is, the offspring or the next generation. And then we can look here and see that this particular couple, this is called the parental generation. Okay, their offspring are referred to as the F1 or first filial generation. Okay, so this square here, that would indicate that their first offspring was a son or a daughter. It was a son. That's what the square is. So this is the eldest or oldest offspring. Okay, it's on the left. Younger offspring are down here, so their youngest child was also a male. But they had a daughter and another son in the middle. Okay. Then some of those offspring, actually all of those offspring, had children themselves. So again, this is the next generation, the mating or the marriage, and their offspring. So this is called the F2 or second filial generation. Okay. So you should probably be jotting in those notes unless you're really adept in family trees. And some people might be, if their parents use Ancestry.com, you might be really good at this. So this particular pedigree, this family tree that shows genetic traits, so it's called a pedigree, shows that only males are affected. Now this would indicate to us, if we had done sex-linked traits, that this trait was carried on the X chromosome. I'm going to mention this, but we skipped over this part. So we talked about females having 2 X chromosomes. Males have an X and a Y. So some of those traits that are carried on the X chromosome, like male pattern baldness or red-green color blindness, males exhibit those traits more frequently because they don't have that second copy of the X chromosome to mask what's on this one, okay? So just keep that in mind. But what we need to learn, what they're going to ask us in our questions is it a dominant trait or a recessive trait? And then they're going to ask us what the genotypes of the individuals are. So that's what we're going to look at, and I'm going to give you some tips on how to figure that out. So again, pedigrees are useful in genetics as it allows us to see what individuals are affected with what traits. And again, normally we're looking at diseases. You can have genetic counselors now. So if you do have a disease that runs in your family, a genetic counselor will work with you and your spouse or mate to figure out what the chances of an offspring having that particular disease are. Okay, so there are some key things that you need to know about pedigrees. So again, first of all, that those circles are females, squares are males. If they're shaded in, that means they're affected with that trait. Now I've got the next one in brackets here. So if the trait shows up more in males than, sorry, that should say than in females, then it's sex-linked. And that is true, but we didn't do sex-linked traits this year. So I put it in brackets because, you can keep that in the back of your brain. If you choose to take grade 12 biology, it'll come up again. And if not, don't worry about it. However, if the trait shows up roughly equally in males and females, does it have to be exactly 4 and 4? No, it could be 2 and 3. That's roughly equally. Males and females, then it's autosomal. Then it comes on those chromosomes 1 to 22, those pairs, not the sex chromosomes. Now, this is really what you need to know here, this last 2 lines, and that's why it's bolded. How do I tell if it's a dominant or recessive trait? Well, this is the easiest way I can tell you to tell. If 2 parents are not affected, okay, so those 2 parents, they don't have it. They're not shaded in. But they have an offspring that does have the trait. And it kind of seems to pop out of nowhere. Maybe it's a surprise that these 2 brown-eyed people had a blue-eyed baby. Then the trait is recessive. It pops out of nowhere. Okay? If the trait is more frequent and present in all generations, then it is likely dominant. It's not a guarantee, but that's what they're getting at in most of these genetic problems. There are traits that the majority of the population is recessive for. So the example I'd like to give is a disease called Huntington's disease or Huntington's chorea. Huntington's disease is an autosomal dominant disease. So that means you only need 1 copy of that allele to be affected with the disease. Most of us are recessive for it. Okay, Huntington's disease shows up usually later in life, so in your 40s. And usually by the time people are in their 40s, if they're going to have had children, they've had them already. So they've already passed that disease on without knowing that they had it. And basically, it's a debilitating disease. You eventually just lose control of most of your faculties, and it's fatal. Okay, so that's just an example where most of the population is recessive for that particular disease. So that's why I say it's likely dominant. And in these questions that I'm going to give you now, that will be the case. Okay, so I'm just going to move this recording thing around, try to get it to a spot. There we go. So P generation, so you need to fill in that that's the parental generation. So this is the bottom of the page you've been working on. F1 generation is called the first filial generation. Okay, these are the offspring of the parents. The F2 generation is the second filial generation. Those are the offspring of the first filial generation. So we label them P, F1, F2 to help with clarity when we're examining some of these things. Okay, and I'm going to show you another way that you might see them numbered, but I'll give you a second to copy those things down before I start. Okay, so again, okay, so I'd like to show you sometimes how you'll see things labeled on a pedigree. So you can, I put the pedigree back up from the top of page 58, so you can go back and add those on. So sometimes the different generations are labeled with a Roman numeral. Okay, so that parental generation would be Roman numeral 1. Okay, and then the people in that generation are numbered 1 and 2 from left to right. So if I wanted to ask you a question about the specific genotype of Roman numeral 1-2, you could easily figure out what individual that was. Does that kind of make sense to people? So then the second generation, that first filial generation, that's 2. And again, people are numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 from left to right. And this would be generation number 3. And again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, so then it's really easy if I want to ask you a question. Maybe it's an exam question. I don't want you to go through everybody, but I want to know what the genotype of person 2-6 is. Then you can go to that and look over. Okay, does that kind of make sense to people? All right, so what we're going to do now, I was going to do task 4 with you, but I'm going to do it together as a class. Okay, and then I've got another handout that I'll give you to work on your own. So if you can turn in your booklet to, actually this is on page 60, okay? We're going to go through this together. Okay, so this is page 60. I'm sorry, it's not task 4. Oh, and it's not going to let me write on it. Of course it's not, because I'm should. My apologies. Here we go. Okay, so this is again page 60 in your booklet. It's not task 4. Yeah, it's the end of task 14. Okay, so by studying human pedigrees, you can determine whether a trait is dominant or recessive. And we're going to go back to that information on page 58 that tells us how to tell if it's dominant or recessive in a minute. So to interpret the 3 pedigrees, and we're only going to do 2 of the 3 because the third one on that sheet, question number 8, deals with sex-linked traits. So we're not going to do that one. We're going to use this genetic key shown here. So if it's a shaded square, that means the male is affected. Unshaded, it's a male without the trait. Shaded, it's a female with whatever trait we're looking at. If it's unshaded, the female's without that trait. Okay, so if they have the trait, they could be homozygous dominant, heterozygous, or they could be homozygous recessive, depending on how that trait's passed through. Okay, so not all of the pedigrees show a sex-linked trait. So again, we're only going to look at the first 2 that don't show sex-linked traits. And refer to those key things to know about pedigrees on kind of the page before, page 58. So this pedigree here shows the inheritance of attached earlobes. Okay, so if you have a free earlobe, it's very clear that there's an indent before your ear is attached to your neck. Okay, it goes up. Attached earlobes don't have that. Okay, so this pedigree shows the inheritance of attached earlobes of 4 generations. Okay, so the first question is the trait for attached earlobes dominant or recessive? Okay, what do you think? So if we refer back to the key things to know about pedigrees on page 58, the bold kind of close to the bottom, it says if the 2 parents are not affected with the trait, but their offspring is, then the trait is recessive. It pops out of nowhere. If the trait is more frequent and present in all generations, then the trait is likely dominant. Is it present in all generations? Is this trait pretty frequent? No. So right away we can say, it might not be dominant. Do we see it pop out of nowhere? 2 parents are not affected, but the child is? Yes. Okay, so here, neither parent has it, but this individual, their first son, has it. Okay, down in this F3 generation, we see a female with the trait, with attached earlobes, but neither parent has it. So this indicates that the trait is recessive. And you can say something like, how do you know? Well, because you can say something like it pops out of nowhere, if that makes sense to you. Or you could say something like neither parent has the trait, but they pass it to their offspring. Okay, so we're going to take it one step further. This doesn't ask that. This doesn't ask us to do this, but the sheet I'm going to give you later to work on does. So we want to assign genotypes to these individuals. So we've already decided that attached earlobes, so let's call that little a, is a recessive trait. So those free lobes, let's use a capital A. Okay? So far, so good? So we need to assign genotypes to these people in our family tree. So let's look at this male in the F1 generation that's affected with this trait. He's affected with a recessive trait. So what is his genotype going to be? What kind of A's will he have? Big A, big A, big A, little a, or little a, little a? Well, can he have a capital A and exhibit the recessive trait? No. So this individual has to be little a, little a. Okay? His parents are not affected with the trait, so they have at least one capital A. What does their second allele have to be? It has to be that little a because they passed it on, right, to their offspring. Does that make sense? Now the next brother here, we know he's got a big A because he does not have attached earlobes. Can we tell definitively what his second allele is? No, because he could have got a big A or a little a from the other parent. Sorry. So you can either write big A, or big A, little a, or you just write big A blank. Meaning we can't tell. We'd need to have a look if he had offspring. We'd need to have a look at what his offspring looked like. Same as this daughter here. Big A. Oh, blank. Sorry. I don't know what I'm doing. Big A blank. We don't know what her second allele is. Okay. We get over to this one, and again, that's about all we can do here. It's big A blank, big A blank. And again, same with these ones. We can't tell. Okay? So we'll put those blanks in. But when we get to that third generation, we know these ones, the first two, the two eldest had a big A. But this individual here, this female here, had two little a's. She's affected with the trait. She's shaded twice. So again, now we can go back in and fill in that those parents had to at least have had a little a. That's all we can know for sure. Okay, so again, you're going to have to do this on your own, so please make sure you're copying this down. We can bet that this little a likely came from here, so you could kind of surmise that that female in that F1 generation probably had a little a, but we don't know for sure. Any questions? All right. Now we're going to look at a dominant trait. Oh, sorry. Well, now I just gave it away. Okay. Now stop spoiling the surprise. Okay, so I've already given away that this trait is dominant, so my apologies. But now I'll tell you why. Okay. So is it present in all the generations? Yep. Is it fairly predominant? Are there a lot of people affected with it versus not? Yes. So this shows the inheritance of tongue rolling. So tongue rolling is the ability to make a U with your tongue. Okay, so can you do this with your tongue? Make it into a U. Most people can, but some people can't. No matter how hard they try, their tongue will just kind of, they can stick it out, but they can't make it into that U shape. Okay, so let's say if people have a big T, they're a tongue roller. And little t is a non-roller. Okay, so again, how do we know it's dominant or recessive dominant? Because it's frequent. Okay, that means a lot of people have it. And present in all generations. Again, this isn't a definitive as we get more complicated in genetics, but for this stage of the game, that will do as reasons. Okay. So again, now I want to take a second and go back and look at what people might be. Okay. So again, this time we're going to use T. So if they've got a big T, they're a tongue roller. So remember, this time, if they're shaded, they're affected with the tongue rolling, that dominant trait. So if they're shaded, they have at least one big T. This one's not shaded, so it's got to have two little t's. We can't tell from looking at this mother in the P1 generation what her second allele is. We'll have to kind of go back once we've decoded what her offspring are. So again, this one has a big T. Do we know what that first son, what his second allele is? We can't actually tell because dad only had two little t's. So dad must have given a little t. Perfect. Oh, this one individual here is not shaded, so they have to have two lowercase t's. So does that give us a clue as to what mom's second allele was? In order for this one to have that second little t, they must have got it from mom, right? So her second allele that we couldn't determine by looking at her, once we know what offspring she's had, we can go back and figure that out. Again, this one individual here has at least have one big T, but again, that dad can only give a little t, so it has to be big T, little t. She marries a fella that's can't roll his tongue, so he's little t, little t. Okay, and again, we can look at their offspring. They have one offspring that's got two little t's. Okay, this one has a big T, but again, dad can only give a little t, big T, little t. Now, this last generation is a little bit tricky. Okay, we can't definitively tell what the mother has, but we know all the offspring have at least one big T, okay, because they're all shaded. They all have that dominant trait. They can all roll their tongues. The dad can only give a little t. So chances are mom was big T, or big T, little t. Well, if she was big T, little t, would we expect probably one of those offspring to not be able to roll their tongues if she had a little t? Yes, we would. So because none of them can, likely it's big T, big T. Now, it's not definitive. Okay, so if you left that one blank, I would have to accept that because it's possible that just random chance you have four offsprings, right? Just like you should have 50-50 boys or girls. We all know families that have four girls or four boys, right? And we know that probably statistically, you know, that's unlikely. So again, this is possible to have this F3 generation with no non-rollers, but with a little t, but more likely she was big T, big T. Okay, are there any questions?